Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. The Seamstress of Belgravia. The Reid townhouse on Belgravia Square was a monument to solemn opulence, a place where the very air seemed thick with the weight of expectation and the scent of beeswax polished into generations of mahogany. Downstairs, in the drawing rooms and the grand dining hall, life was a carefully orchestrated performance played out against a backdrop of claret-red velvet draperies that drank the London sunlight and gas lamps that bled a weak, jaundiced glow onto portraits of stern-faced ancestors. It was a world of hushed footfalls on Turkish carpets, of the low murmur of consequential conversation, a world that belonged entirely to the Reids. Upstairs, 3 floors above the gilded silence, was another world. The sewing room, tucked away at the end of a narrow servants' corridor, was a universe unto itself. It was a practical, cramped space, yet it held a life and energy the grand rooms below could never possess. Here the air was warm and carried the clean, honest scents of hot irons pressing damp linen, of lavender sachets tucked between bolts of fabric, and the almost living perfume of silk and wool. Sunlight, unfiltered by heavy curtains, fell in bright, dusty shave shafts across a large cutting table, illuminating a constellation of stray threads, silver pins and chalk marks. This was the world of Courtney Berg. Courtney's own world was one of quiet, focused labour. Her life was stitched together by the twin threads of necessity and devotion, the necessity of earning a wage, and her fierce, consuming devotion to her ailing mother, whose soft cough was the metronome to which Courtney's needle danced. She was an apprentice, a pair of hands in the employ of the esteemed Madame Dubois, but her fingers were more nimble, her eye for a seam more precise than any of the other girls. There was a stillness about her as she worked, a concentration so profound it was a form of prayer. Within this small room she was not merely a girl mending a hem, she was an architect of dreams coaxing flat cloths all into forms of beauty. And yet she carried within her the deep, unvoiced wound of the working class, a constant gnawing feeling of invisibility. She was a function, a service, an instrument. She was rarely a person. Mr. Darren Reid, by contrast, was seen by everyone. He was the young master of the house, a barrister of burgeoning reputation, and since his father's recent sudden death, the reluctant patriarch of the Reid dynasty. His life was a cage of duty, its bars forged from the immense pressure to uphold his family's prestigious name. He moved through the grand, silent rooms of his home like a ghost haunting his own future. Grief and responsibility had sealed his heart behind a fortress of cynical pragmatism. He had come to believe emotion was a liability, a weakness a man in his position could ill afford. The loneliness of his self-imposed command was a burden heavier than any legal brief he carried in his leather satchel. Their 2 worlds, separated by a mere 39 steps of polished oak staircase, might as well have been separated by an ocean. But one Tuesday afternoon, that ocean was crossed. Darren strode into the sewing room without knocking, his presence a sudden jarring intrusion of leather and starched linen into a soft world of cambric and thread. He did not look at the 2 girls bent over their work, their heads bowed in silent industry. His focus was singular, his patience, as always, a finite resource. Madame Dubois, he began, his voice crisp and devoid of warmth. My sister is growing agitated. She was promised a fitting for the Derby gown an hour ago. This delay is becoming trying. The older seamstress, a plump woman with flustered eyes, rose at once. My apologies, Mr. Reid. The silk taffeta, it is temperamental, it resists the needle. Darren's gaze remained fixed on a half-finished bodice pinned to a dress form, his expression one of profound irritation. Temperamental fabric is not a sufficient explanation for my sister's distress. The fault lies, as it usually does, with inadequate preparation or a lack of skill. He gestured vaguely toward the garment. Surely the girl could work faster. He meant Courtney. Nay. He had not once glanced in her direction, yet the dismissal in his tone, the casual reduction of her to the girl, was as palpable as a slap. It was the familiar ache of being overlooked, of being rendered a piece of the furniture. A familiar resignation settled in her chest, but alongside it, something else flickered, a tiny sharp spark of defiance. She did not lift her head. Her needle continued its steady rhythmic journey through a line of pearl buttons on a cuff, a tiny silver fish darting through white water. Her voice, when it came, was low and even, utterly devoid of the deference he expected. "The fault, sir," she said to the cuff in her hands, "is not with the needle, but with the thread. The silk thread required for such a fine weave is prone to snapping if the tension is not precisely managed with the warp of the taffeta. Haste would only result in a puckered seam, which I imagine would cause Miss Caroline far more distress than a brief delay." The silence that followed was absolute. The other seamstress held her breath. The only sound was the delicate snick of Courtney's scissors as she snipped the thread, the task completed. Her words, so precise, so technical, so unexpectedly intelligent, hung in the air. They were not an excuse, but a statement of fact, delivered with a dry, unshakable confidence that was utterly out of place. It was the voice of an expert, not a servant. Slowly, as if compelled by a force beyond his control, Darren Reid turned his head. His gaze, which had swept over the room and its occupants as little more than a collection of objects, now fell upon the young woman with the downcast eyes and the clever voice. He saw the burnished copper of her hair, pinned in a simple severe knot at the nape of her neck. He saw the elegant line of that neck, bent in concentration, and the dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose. He saw the strength and purpose in her hands, not the delicate, idle hands of the women in his circle, but the nimble, capable hands of a creator. And when, at last, she felt the weight of his stare and lifted her head, he saw her eyes. They were the colour of moss after a rain, and in their depths he saw not subservience, but a clear, startling flicker of a spirit as proud and unyielding as his own. In that moment, she ceased to be the girl. The walls of the sewing room seemed to dissolve. The 39 steps between their worlds vanished. He saw a woman, and Courtney Berg, looking into the surprised, dark eyes of the young barrister, felt a sensation so foreign and so potent it nearly made her gasp. She felt seen. The countless fittings required for Caroline Reid's debutante season became the unlikely stage upon which their silent drama unfolded. An unspoken awareness now existed between them, a current that hummed beneath the surface of every polite exchange and stolen glance. Darren began to find excuses to be present. He would appear in the doorway of the sewing room, a volume of tort law in his hand, and settle into a worn armchair in the corner, ostensibly to study. He would turn the pages of his book with a convincing rustle, but his attention was not on the dry legal precedents. It was on her. He watched her quiet, unflagging patience as she navigated his sister's petulant whims. Caroline would complain that a waistline was a fraction too high, that a shade of blue made her look pallid, that a cascade of lace was insufficiently grand. And through it all, Courtney would murmur assent, her hands moving with a placid grace, her expression a mask of professional calm. Darren, who knew the full force of his sister's temper, found himself marvelling at the young dressmaker's diplomacy. He saw the fierce, quiet pride she took in her craft, the way her brow would furrow in concentration as she measured a seam, the small, almost imperceptible smile that touched her lips when a difficult drape finally fell into perfect submission. He saw not just a skill, but an artistry. and it fascinated him. One evening, well after the rest of the household had settled into the rhythms of the night, he was descending the main staircase when a sliver of light from under the sewing room door caught his eye. Puzzled, he pushed it open to find her there alone, bent over her work, the room illuminated by the lonely golden halo of a single candle. The flickering light caught the fire in her hair and cast her shadow long and graceful against the wall. She was stitching a constellation of tiny iridescent beads onto a bodice, her needle a patient star finder in a midnight blue sky of silk. "You're working late," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She started, a hand flying to her chest. "Mr. Reid, I did not hear you." "I'm sorry to have disturbed you. I was on my way to my study." He did not leave. He lingered in the doorway, drawn by the intimacy of the scene. "That looks intricate." "It is," she admitted, her eyes returning to her work. "The beading for the Duchess's ball gown. It must be finished by Friday." "And Madame Dubois leaves such a task to you, alone, by candlelight." A flicker of that pride he had come to recognise warmed her voice. "She trusts my hands are steady." He stepped into the room, his presence filling the small space. "And what of your dreams, Miss Berg? Do they extend beyond stitching for duchesses?" The question was so direct, so personal, it took her aback. She paused, needle held mid-air. No one of his station had ever asked such a thing. I hope one day to have my own shop," she confessed, the words tasting strange and bold on her tongue. "A small one, perhaps, where I could choose my own fabrics, create my own designs." He listened, his expression unreadable in the wavering light, and for the first time they spoke not as master and servant, but as two people sharing the quiet space of a late hour. Their true connection, however, was forged in the London fog. A few weeks later, a thick yellow-grey blanket descended upon the city with a sudden suffocating totality. It swirled through the streets, muting sound, blurring the sharp edges of the world, and turning the familiar gas lamps into ghostly, indistinct orbs. Courtney, finishing her work for the day, found her journey home rendered impossible. The carriages were all grounded, their drivers unwilling to navigate the treacherous, blind streets. As she stood hesitating in the grand entryway, clutching her shawl, Darren appeared at her side. "You cannot possibly walk home in this," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "It is not safe." "I have no choice, sir." "Nonsense. I will escort you." Before she could protest, he was shrugging on his greatcoat. He was acting, he told himself, merely out of a sense of duty, a gentleman's obligation to a woman in his family's employ. It was a convenient and necessary lie. Stepping out into the fog was like stepping into another realm. The city's roar was muffled to a distant hum. The imposing facades of the Belgravia townhouses dissolved into murky shadows. They were cocooned, isolated from the rigid watching eyes of society. In this anonymous, misty world, the carefully constructed barriers between them seemed to thin and fray. She spoke of her mother, of the constant worry that was the baseline of her existence, and of the small village in the countryside where she was born. He in turn found himself confessing the crushing weight of his father's legacy, the fear that he was merely an inadequate custodian of a name far greater than himself. The fog became their confessional, its dense veil granting them the courage to be vulnerable. For the length of that walk they were not Mr. Darren Reid, the barrister, and Courtney Berg, the apprentice. They were simply a man and a woman, their shoulders occasionally brushing, their voices low and intimate in the swirling grey. The final fitting for the magnificent ball gown that was to be the centrepiece of Caroline's season marked the culmination of this simmering tension. Courtney was on her knees, making a final adjustment to the hem, a line of pins held between her lips. Darren, as usual, was in his corner armchair, the pretence of reading long since abandoned. As she reached for another pin, a sharp point pricked the tip of her index finger. A perfect ruby-red droplet of blood welled up, a stark jewel against her pale skin. It happened in an instant. Before she could even think to pull her hand away to staunch the tiny wound, he was there. He moved from his chair with a swift, silent urgency that startled her, kneeling before her on the floor. "You've hurt yourself," he murmured, his voice thick with a concern that went far beyond the triviality of the injury. He took her hand. His own was warm and strong, engulfing hers completely. The calloused skin of his thumb stroked over the tiny red bead, smearing it slightly. The touch was electric, a jolt that shot up her arm and settled hot and heavy in the pit of her stomach. It was a gesture of such unexpected disarming tenderness that it stole the breath from her lungs. He did not release her. His thumb continued its slow, hypnotic caress over her fingertip, over the whorls of her skin. He lifted his gaze from her hand to her face, and his eyes were dark with an intensity that made her feel utterly exposed, as if he could see straight into the frantic, hopeful, terrified beating of her heart. The air in the room grew thick, charged with all the words they had never spoken, all the longing they had so carefully concealed. The scent of lavender from the sachets in her sewing box, the whisper of the silk gown, the sight of his dark head bent so close to hers, it all coalesced into a moment of pure agonizing wanting. It was a near confession, a declaration held in the heated space between their clasped hands, a promise and a peril all at once. His powerful attraction and the ruinous, unthinkable scandal of a liaison with her waged a silent, furious war in the depths of his gaze, and in that moment Courtney knew, with a certainty that was both thrilling and terrifying, that he was losing. It is a truth universally acknowledged that in a house of many servants, no secret, however small, can long remain confined. The moment of profound tenderness in the sewing room, the master of the house kneeling before the seamstress, his hand holding hers with such reverent care, was not unobserved. A lady's maid, passing the open door on her way to fetch a shawl for her mistress, had seen it all. She was a woman whose own ambitions had long ago curdled into a bitter jealousy, and the sight of such intimacy shared across the unbridgeable chasm of class was an affront she could not abide. The story, embellished with each retelling, began its insidious journey through the servants' passages, a whispered confection of malicious gossip that finally, inevitably, reached the ears of the one person Darren Reid truly feared, his mother. Mrs. Reid was a formidable matriarch, a woman cast in the same unyielding iron as the gates that guarded their home. Her world was governed by the cold calculus of lineage, reputation, and strategic alliances. To her, love was a frivolous luxury. Marriage was a merger. She had already selected the perfect candidate to be her son's wife, the Honourable Miss Eleanor Vance, a banking heiress whose fortune was as vast as her countenance was cold. The union would secure the Reid family's finances for a generation. The whispers of her son's infatuation with a common seamstress were not merely an embarrassment. They were a threat to the very foundation of her carefully laid plans. She cornered Darren in his late father's study, the one room in the house where he felt the weight of his legacy most acutely. Her accusations were precise, her language sharp and contemptuous. "They say you have been making a spectacle of yourself with one of the sewing girls, that you fawn over her like a stable boy. Have you lost your senses entirely? Do you have any idea what a scandal of this nature would do to our name, to the negotiations with the Vances?" Darren, trapped between the jaws of duty and desire, felt a cold terror overwhelm him. He saw his future laid out before him, the public humiliation, the snickering of his peers, the smirch upon a name his father had kept pristine. He saw the disappointment in his mother's eyes, a weapon she had wielded with devastating effect his entire life, and in a moment of profound, gut-wrenching cowardice his heart failed him. His feelings for Courtney, so potent and real in the quiet of the sewing room, suddenly seemed a reckless, impossible folly. "It is baseless gossip," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He could not meet his mother's gaze, focusing instead on a portrait of his father above the mantelpiece. "The girl is merely a seamstress, competent at her work, nothing more. I have no interest in the hired help." As fate, in its infinite cruelty, would have it, Courtney was at that very moment walking down the upstairs corridor. She had come to deliver Caroline's finished ball gown, carefully draped over her arms in a protective linen sheath. The door to the study was slightly ajar, and his voice, clear and cold, carried into the hallway. Merely a seamstress, no interest in the hired help. The words struck her with the physical force of a blow. Each syllable was a shard of ice lodging in her heart. All the shared moments, the conversation by candlelight, the walk in the fog, the electrifying touch of his hand on hers, crumbled into dust. They had meant nothing. She had been a fool, a ridiculous, hopeful fool, to believe for even a second that she could be more than an object of passing amusement to a man like him. His casual, brutal cruelty confirmed her deepest, most painful fear, that to him she had never been a person. She was, and always would be, invisible. Her breath hitched, a strangled sob caught in her throat. Without making a sound, she turned and fled back to the safety of the sewing room, the magnificent gown a dead weight in her arms. The world, which had briefly seemed to shimmer with possibility, was once again leached of all its colour, reduced to the stark, unforgiving black and white of her station. Heartbroken and profoundly humiliated, she erected a wall of icy professionalism around herself. She finished the remainder of her commission for the Reids with a detached mechanical efficiency. She answered Caroline's questions in clipped monosyllables and avoided any room where Darren might be. On the few occasions their paths did cross, she would look through him as if he were made of glass, her face a pale, beautiful mask of indifference. She retreated into the only world that had never betrayed her, the certain, tangible world of needle and thread, of silk and satin. Her spirit ached with a grief so deep it felt like a physical wound, but her hands at least remained steady. Darren, meanwhile, was consumed by a Schweitzen, corrosive self-loathing. The memory of his own words, of the lie he had told to save his skin, played on a loop in his mind. He had betrayed not only Courtney, but himself. He had sacrificed something true and vital for the sake of a hollow, meaningless social standing. He buried himself in his work, spending long nights at his law chambers, but he could not escape the ghost of her. The silence in the grand house, once a comfort, was now a constant, deafening reminder of her absence, of the vibrant, intelligent life that had briefly illuminated its shadowed corners, and which he, through his own weakness, had extinguished. The night of the Duchess of Abernathy's grand ball, the most anticipated event of the London season, arrived on a wave of carriage wheels and societal chatter. Inside the Reid mansion, however, the mood was far from festive. Caroline, in a final fit of pre-ball pique over some imagined slight, had yanked at the bodice of her gown with such force that a crucial seam along the waist had torn with a sickening final-sounding rip. Hysteria ensued. It was an hour before they were due to depart. No other gown would do. There was only one solution. A footman was dispatched with breathless urgency to the small, cramped flat where Courtney Berg lived with her mother. She was summoned back to the house she had sworn she would never enter again. When she arrived, her face was a pale, determined mask. She refused all offers of tea, all attempts at apology from a flustered Mrs. Reid. She simply took the damaged gown and ascended the stairs to the sewing room, her sanctuary and her prison. Darren found her there. He had been pacing his study like a caged animal, the sounds of his sister's distress a mere backdrop to the storm raging within him. He knew she had been sent for, and the knowledge was both a torment and a desperate, fragile hope. When he pushed open the door, the sight of her brought him to a halt. She was kneeling by the low light of a lamp, her head bent, her nimble fingers already flying, stitching the ruined seam with a furious precision. She did not acknowledge him. The air was thick with her silence, a silence that was louder than any accusation. The sight of her, so close and yet so impossibly distant, so composed in her heartbreak, finally broke him. The dam of his fear, his pride, and his carefully constructed duty shattered. "Courtney," he began, his voice rough. She did not look up. "It will be mended in a quarter of an hour, Mr. Reid. Your sister will not be late." "To hell with my sister," he bit out, stepping further into the room. "It's you. I must speak with you." "We have nothing to speak of." "We have everything to speak of." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping before her. "What you heard, what I said to my mother, it was a lie. A contemptible, cowardly lie born of fear." At last she looked up, her moss-green eyes blazing with a cold, righteous anger. "Fear, Mr. Reid? Or convenience? It is a convenient thing, is it not, to dismiss the feelings of the hired help when they become troublesome?" The contempt in her voice lashed him like a whip. He flinched. "Yes," he admitted, his own voice raw with self-disgust. "It was that too. I was a coward. I was terrified of the scandal, of my mother, of losing everything my father built. But the greatest lie was not to her, it was to myself, because the truth, Courtney, the god-awful, inconvenient, terrifying truth is that I am in love with you." His confession, so long suppressed, hung in the charged air between them, but it was met not with softness, but with the full force of her pain. She rose to her feet, her movements fluid and furious, her words as sharp and piercing as her needles. "Love," she spat, her voice trembling with a passion that was almost rage. "You call it love to humiliate me, to cast me aside like a soiled garment the moment your position is threatened. That is not love. That is the casual cruelty of a master to his possession. You saw me not as a woman, but as a dalliance, a diversion from your oh-so-burdened life." "No, that is not true," he insisted, stepping closer, his hands clenched at his sides. "I see you more clearly than I see anyone else in my life. I see your strength, your wit, your heart. I see the artist you are, and it terrifies me because loving you means razing my entire world to the ground." "Then let it burn," she cried, tears of fury and heartbreak finally tracing shining paths down her pale cheeks. "But do not stand here and speak to me of love when you lack the courage to even speak my name with respect." The argument was a tempest, a storm of passion that stripped away every last shred of pretense, every layer of social restraint, until only the raw, wounded, vulnerable truth of their 2 hearts remained. And then words failed. With a sound that was half groan, half plea, he closed the distance between them. His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs stroking away her tears. His eyes begged for a forgiveness he did not deserve, and then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, frantic collision, a plea and a confession and a demand all at once. It was the taste of his regret and her rage, of his longing and her sorrow. And for a heart-stopping moment, she resisted, her hands flat against his chest. But then, with a choked sob, her own pent-up desire, so ruthlessly suppressed, surged to the surface. Her hands curled into the fabric of his coat, pulling him closer, and she answered his kiss with all the fierce, aching need she had denied for so long. It was a collision of worlds, of upstairs and downstairs, of duty and desire. Breaking the kiss, breathless, he took her hand. "Not here," he rasped, his voice thick. "Not in this room." He led her from the sewing room, down the silent corridor, past the portraits of his ancestors, their painted eyes judging him. He led her to the library. The room was dark, save for the moonlight slanting through the tall windows, illuminating the scent of old leather, and rain beginning to patter against the glass. He locked the door behind them. Here, surrounded by the weight of his history, he chose to defy it. Their coming together was not a gentle, timid exploration. It was a fierce and transcendent claiming. It was the raw, elemental honesty of two souls shedding their skins, breaking free of the cages that had confined them. His hands, no longer hesitant, moved over her with a reverence that was a form of worship. He unpinned her hair, letting the copper cascade fall over her shoulders, a silken curtain of fire in the moonlight. Her fingers worked at the buttons of his stiff shirt, her touch both hesitant and hungry. He laid her down upon the rich dark velvet of a chaise lounge, the fabric cool against her skin as he lifted the hem of her simple dress. There was a wildness in their coupling, a sacredness born of desperation. It was a surrender not to one another, but to a truth that was more powerful than society, more profound than name or station. Every touch was a word in a new language they were inventing together. Every kiss, a verse in a holy text known only to them. His body spoke of a deep primal tenderness, a need to protect and cherish even in the midst of his fierce passion. And her response was one of utter, trusting vulnerability, a complete opening of the gates of her heart and soul. In this act, she was not submitting, she was meeting him, matching his intensity with her own, claiming him as he was claiming her. It was a sacred sealing of their bond, written not in ink, but in the heated language of flesh and spirit, a promise made in the silent, rain-lashed dark. Afterward, as they lay tangled together, the storm outside mirroring the one that had broken within them, Darren looked at her, at the woman who had undone him and remade him in the space of a single hour. In her arms, he finally understood. True honour was not found in upholding a name or a fortune. It lay in loving fiercely, honestly, and without shame. And Courtney, looking into the vulnerable, unguarded eyes of the man who had broken her heart, found in his utter surrender the strength to forgive. She understood that love, true love, was not a safe harbour. It was a tempest, and its only demand was that you risk your whole heart to its magnificent, terrifying power. The aftermath of the Duchess's ball was not the scandal of a torn seam, but the far more seismic shock of Mr. Darren Reid's quiet, resolute rebellion. The following morning, with a clarity of purpose that felt like breathing for the first time, he went to his mother. He did not raise his voice, he did not argue. He simply informed her in the calm, unequivocal tones of a barrister stating an irrefutable fact that his informal understanding with the Honourable Miss Eleanor Vance was at an end. And then he told her he intended to court Miss Courtney Berg, and that her opinion on the matter, while noted, was ultimately irrelevant. The ensuing storm was precisely as furious as he had anticipated. His mother threatened disinheritance. The Vances were insulted. Whispers turned to audible gossip that spread through the drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs of London like wildfire. But Darren, to the astonishment of all, remained unwavering. He weathered the ostracism and the condescending pity of his peers with a placid conviction that baffled them. He had spent his life shackled by the fear of their judgment. Now, liberated by a love he finally deemed worth fighting for, their opinions were no more than the buzzing of inconsequential flies. He did not hide Courtney away. He did not treat her as a shameful secret to be squirreled away in some discreet cottage. Instead, he celebrated her. He arrived at her modest flat, not in a closed, unmarked carriage, but in his own, the Reid crest emblazoned on the door for all the world to see. He walked with her in the park on a Sunday afternoon, ignoring the stares and the hastily turned backs. He discovered that the courage he had always sought in the courtroom was a pale imitation of the courage it took to love openly and without condition. His greatest act of devotion, however, was not in defiance of society, but in tribute to her. He saw the artist his mother and his world refused to see. Using his legal prowess, he established a business venture, and with his own financial resources, He became the primary investor for a new dressmaking establishment in a respectable sunlit corner of Mayfair. It was to be called simply Berg. Months passed, months of hard work and shared purpose. Their love, forged in the crucible of conflict, now settled into the steady, warm rhythm of partnership. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after he'd first barged into the sewing room, Darren entered her shop. It was a world away from the cramped attic room at Belgravia Square. Here light streamed through a grand plate glass window, illuminating bolts of shimmering silks and Welsh wools. The air smelled of jasmine tea and creative energy. Courtney stood in the centre of the room consulting with a client, her expression confident, her posture elegant. She was no longer an apprentice but a proprietress, a creator, a woman in full command of her own destiny. Seeing him, she excused herself, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. He met her in the middle of the bustling showroom, in front of her staff and her patrons, and to her complete astonishment, he went down on one knee. A hush fell over the room. Darren ignored the collective intake of breath. He did not produce a diamond ring, the expected currency of a society proposal. Instead, he held out a small bespoke case of polished silver. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark blue velvet, lay an exquisite set of sewing needles, each one perfectly weighted and balanced. And beside them, a single, simple gold thimble. He took her right hand, the hand that had worked so tirelessly, the hand that had held his in the fog, the hand that bore the tiny faded scar from a pinprick. "For the hands that stitched my life back together," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to conceal. He slipped the gold thimble onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Looking up at her, he saw that her eyes were shining with tears, not of sorrow or anger, but of a profound, overwhelming joy. He had not offered her a symbol of his wealth, but a tribute to her strength, her talent, her very soul. Engraved on the inside of the thimble, too small for anyone else to see, were two words: Amor Edificator, Love the Builder. She leaned down and kissed him, a deep, tender kiss that was a promise and a conclusion all in one. It was a seal on a future they would build together, a life constructed not according to society's brittle, unforgiving rules, but with their own hands, stitched with a thread that had been tested and had not broken, destined to last a lifetime. Love's eternal beacon. The village of Quanroys did not so much exist on the Irish coast as persist against it. It was a place of stubborn stone and resilient quiet, where the air, thick with the ghosts of sea salt and peat smoke, seemed to hang in a perpetual silvered mist. The 21st century had arrived here only in whispers, a satellite dish on a thatched roof, the occasional glint of a smartphone through a pub window. But the soul of the place remained ancient, bound by crumbling walls overrun with moss, and the melancholy bleat of sheep wandering roads no wider than a memory. Presiding over this forgotten corner of the world was the lighthouse. It stood on a windswept cliff like a stoic, weary sentinel, its white paint flaking in long strips, revealing the grey stone beneath as if shedding old skin. It was not a picturesque ruin. It was a functional thing, a creature of duty, its gaze forever fixed on the tumultuous slate of the Atlantic. It was this light, a sweeping blade of pure white in the gathering gloom, that drew Cillian, not as a point of interest for an article, but as a last resort. The rain, which had begun as a fine, indecisive drizzle, had escalated with theatrical suddenness into a torrential downpour. His rental car, a soulless silver box utterly unfit for the landscape, had surrendered, with a sigh of punctured rubber on a road that was more pothole than pavement. Cillian was a man in his late 30s who had made a celebrated career of being lost. He was a travel writer, a professional wanderer, whose byline graced the glossy pages of magazines that sold curated authenticity to people in air-conditioned offices. He'd watched the sun rise over Machu Picchu, navigated the spice markets of Marrakesh, and listened to the carving of glaciers in Patagonia. He had seen all the 7 wonders of the modern world and felt, to his profound and secret shame, absolutely nothing. His life had become a series of clever, hollow descriptions, and he feared, with the gnawing certainty of a terminal diagnosis, that he had become as manufactured as the experiences he peddled. He was haunted by the silence that followed the click of his camera, the profound, echoing emptiness in his own heart. Soaked to the bone, his expensive jacket clinging to him like a shroud, he stumbled up the muddy path toward the lighthouse keeper's cottage, a low stone building huddled in the lee of the great tower. He was guided by the simple, unwavering beam that cut through the tempest. He knocked on the heavy oak door, the sound swallowed by the wind's howl, and prepared himself for the suspicion, the reluctance, the inevitable questions. The door opened. The woman who stood there was not what he had expected, though he wasn't sure what that had been. She was in her early 30s, her face unadorned by makeup, framed by dark hair pulled back in a simple, functional knot. Her gaze was direct, her expression not one of welcome or annoyance, but of a calm, unbothered pragmatism. She looked at his drenched state, her eyes flickering from his dripping hair to his waterlogged shoes, and simply stepped back, holding the door open, the words, not a single question. It was the most unsettling and profound welcome he had ever received. This was Maeve. She had inherited the post of lighthouse keeper from her father, and his father before him. The light was in her blood as much as the salt. She was plain-spoken, a woman whose strength was not announced, but was evident in the capable set of her hands and the quiet economy of her movements. She moved with the self-reliance of one who has long been accustomed to the world's indifference. Her heart, however, was walled off by a fierce, protective independence, a fortress built upon a single, painful truth she held to be self-evident. Everyone, eventually, leaves. Inside the cottage was a world of warmth and stillness. A peat fire glowed in the hearth, its earthy scent a balm against the cold. The room was small, filled with well-worn furniture, stacks of books, and the quiet hum of a life lived deliberately. She pointed to a wooden chair by the fire. "Sit," she said. Her voice was low, with the soft lilt of the region, unhurried. "You'll be wanting tea." It was a statement, not a question. Cillian, the man whose profession was to charm his way into foreign spaces, to find the perfect turn of phrase, was rendered mute. He could only nod, shedding his jacket and sinking into the chair, the heat of the fire a shocking pleasure against his chilled skin. She moved about the small kitchen, her actions efficient and graceful, the clink of a mug, the splash of water, the scrape of a spoon against ceramic. These simple sounds, against the backdrop of the storm's fury outside, felt more real, more grounding than any of the exotic soundscapes he had ever recorded. He watched her, this woman who had let a stranger into her home without a word of justification, and felt a profound sense of dislocation. He was the world traveller, the man of 1,000 cities, yet in this small, firelit room, he was the one who was truly out of his element. She handed him a steaming mug. Her fingers brushed his, and the contact was like a low electrical current, a sudden, sharp awareness in the quiet room. He looked up at her, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something in her grey eyes. Not curiosity, but a deep, knowing stillness, as if she were looking past the drenched writer and seeing the hollow man shivering beneath. The spark between them was not the bright, crackling flash of wit or flirtation he was used to. It was quieter, more profound. It was the unnerving, magnetic pull of her genuine, unadorned presence, a silence that demanded nothing and, in doing so, laid his own emptiness bare. He had come seeking shelter from the storm, but as he sat by her fire, sipping her tea, he had the unsettling feeling he'd stumbled upon a different kind of refuge altogether, one he hadn't known he was so desperately seeking. The storm passed, but Cillian stayed. He found a room in the village pub, a place of dark wood and the lingering smell of stale beer, and told himself it was for a story. Ireland's Disappearing Coastlines, he'd called it in his pitch to his editor, a title that felt both suitably dramatic and conveniently vague. The excuse was a flimsy shield for a truth he was not yet ready to confront. He simply could not bring himself to leave the orbit of the lighthouse and the woman who kept it. His days fell into a new, unfamiliar rhythm, governed not by flight schedules and deadlines, but by tides and weather fronts. He found himself at the lighthouse more often than not, drawn by a force he couldn't name. He began tentatively at first to help Maeve with her tasks. It started with an offer to carry a heavy box of supplies up the winding spiral staircase of the tower. She had only nodded, handing it over without ceremony, as if his presence were the most natural thing in the world. He helped her repair a section of fence that the storm had torn from its posts, his soft writer's hands clumsy with the hammer against her sure, steady ones. He learned to mix the whitewash, the lime stinging his nostrils, and painted the cottage walls under her watchful eye. His most hallowed task became polishing the great Fresnel lens in the lantern room. It was a cathedral of glass, a magnificent, intricate beehive that captured and focused the light. As they worked, side by side in the enclosed space, their movements synchronized, a silent ballet of chamois cloths and concentration. He felt a sense of purpose that had long eluded him. Their conversations were like the landscape itself, sparse but with a profound depth beneath the surface. They rarely spoke of feelings, but of things, of the habits of gannets, of the way the sea changed colour before a squall, of the precise mixture of paraffin and air needed for the lamp to burn its brightest. Through these practical discussions, a fragile intimacy began to grow. One evening, as they sat in her cottage sharing tea and a plate of crumbly buttery biscuits, the quiet between them felt charged, expectant. Cillian, emboldened by the warmth of the fire and the whiskey she'd poured into his tea, finally gave voice to the ache that defined him. "I think," he began, his voice rough, "that my job is to collect postcards of other people's lives. I take a snapshot, write a few clever words and move on. I describe the beauty, but I don't feel it. It's all just scenery." He stared into the amber liquid in his mug. "There's no anchor." Maeve was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. He thought perhaps he had said too much, had broken the unspoken rules of their quiet communion. But then she stood, beckoning him with a small motion of her head. She led him to a heavy sea chest in the corner of the room. Lifting the lid, she revealed a collection of thick, leather-bound logbooks, their pages filled with faded copper-plate script. "My father's," she said softly, "and my grandfather's." She opened one, the paper brittle with age. She didn't read from it, but showed him the entries, meticulous records of wind speed, barometric pressure, and sea conditions, interspersed with more personal observations. The Mary Ellen of Killybegs passed at dawn running for shelter. "Saw a pod of dolphins playing in the surf this morning. Repaired the winch mechanism. A devil of a job." Her voice was hushed with reverence as she shared the stories these simple lines contained, of shipwrecks and rescues, of long, solitary winters, of the birth of her father in this very cottage. In her telling, the lighthouse ceased to be a mere structure of stone and glass. It became a living repository of history, a testament to dedication, a lineage of duty and love. Through her reverence for the place, he saw it clearly. Her deep-seated fear was not of loneliness, but of losing this, her only tangible connection to her past. In her quiet, fierce dedication, Cillian saw a raw, powerful beauty that shamed the manufactured wonders he'd been paid to admire. She was not just keeping a light, she was tending a soul. The next day, she took him up to the lantern room to show him the inner workings of the light's clockwork mechanism, the massive system of weights and pulleys that rotated the lens. In a power failure, before the generator kicks in, she explained, it has to be turned by hand. Her hand rested on a large brass crank. You have to feel the rhythm of it. It fights you at first. She guided his hand to the crank, her fingers closing over his to show him the grip. Her skin was cool and calloused, a map of her life's work. The contact, though brief and entirely functional, sent a jolt of profound awareness through him, a current that was both startling and deeply grounding. He could feel the fine tremor in her hand, or perhaps it was his own. The air in the small space grew thick, charged with the unspoken thing that hovered between them. Later that week, as dusk bled purple and rose across the horizon, they stood together on the narrow balcony that encircled the lantern room, watching the sea grow dark. The space was so tight that their shoulders brushed, a constant, warm pressure that anchored him to the moment. The wind whipped a strand of her dark hair across his face, and it smelled of salt and rain. He had an overwhelming, primal urge to turn, to cup her face in his hands, to close the small distance between them and kiss her. But he found himself paralysed, not by fear of rejection, but by something far more complex, the terror of shattering the fragile, sacred peace they had built. A kiss felt like a declaration, an act of possession, and what they had was something wilder, more elemental. It was a space defined by the unspoken understanding, a quiet gravitational pull. He, the man who documented the world, was afraid to make a mark on this small, perfect universe, afraid that his touch might be just another postcard, another fleeting moment he would eventually have to leave behind. So he stood beside her, their bodies touching, and let the moment hang in the salt-laced air. A question mark suspended between the darkening sea and the first pinprick of stars. The world Cillian had tried to outrun finally caught up with him in the form of a single piercing ringtone from his phone. It was Marcus, his agent, his voice a blast of manicured London enthusiasm that felt Juan Reyes. Cillian, my boy, I've done it, I've landed the big one, Marcus boomed, oblivious to the fact that Cillian was standing on a cliff watching a Fulmer ride the updrafts. Forget magazines, we're talking a 6-figure book deal, The Accidental Nomad, and get this, a companion TV series. A year, Cillian, circumnavigating the globe, all expenses paid. You'll be a household name, this is it, the summit. The word struck Cillian not with exhilaration, but with a cold, hollow dread. The summit. He looked at the weathered grey stone of the lighthouse, at the endless, churning expanse of the Atlantic. This felt like the summit. Marcus's offer, the very pinnacle of the life he had built, now felt like a gilded cage, a sentence of another year in motion, another year of feeling nothing. He was torn. A part of him, the part conditioned by years of ambition and the relentless pursuit of the next byline, recognised the magnitude of the offer. It was security. It was validation. It was the finish line he'd been running toward for a decade. But another newer part of him, a part that had been awakened by the quiet rhythms of the lighthouse and the steady presence of Maeve, recoiled. That part knew that accepting the offer would be a kind of death. He had to tell her. He found her in the small vegetable patch behind the cottage, her hands deep in the dark, rich earth, pulling weeds with a methodical patience. He tried to explain, to frame it as the dilemma it was in his own fractured mind. "It's an incredible offer," he said, the words feeling clumsy and false in his mouth. "A book, a television show, it's Everything I've been working for." He watched her face, hoping for what? For her to tell him to stay, to fight for him. But he did not understand the language of her heart. Maeve had spent a lifetime learning to interpret the signs of departure. She heard not his confusion, but the siren song of the world calling him away. She saw the flicker of excitement in his eyes, the professional ambition he couldn't quite conceal, and it confirmed her deepest, most hard-won conviction. She was a port, a place of temporary shelter, but he was a vessel built for the open sea. She straightened up, wiping the soil from her hands onto her trousers. Her expression became smooth, impassive, a mask of polite distance sliding into place. The warmth he'd come to depend on was gone, replaced by a cool, impenetrable courtesy. "Well then," she said, her tone flat, devoid of emotion. "Congratulations. It's what you were made for, Cillian. Go and see the world." "Maeve, it's not that simple," he pleaded, reaching for her arm. She flinched away from his touch as if burned. "Isn't it?" she asked, her voice quiet but edged with steel. "You're a visitor. You are always just passing through. I hope you get everything you want." She turned and walked back to the cottage, her back straight and rigid. She didn't look back. She was pushing him away, preempting the abandonment she saw as inevitable, choosing to make the cut herself rather than wait for the blade to fall. The emotional low point was a brutal diptych of solitude. For Cillian, it was a sterile hotel room in Galway, where he'd driven to think. The lucrative contract glowed on his laptop screen, a string of zeros that promised a fortune and felt like an epitaph. He stared at it, the excited emails from Marcus pinging in his inbox, and felt an emptiness so vast and profound it threatened to swallow him whole. The entire world, with all its wonders and possibilities, had shrunk. It felt small, loud and colourless compared to the quiet, infinite universe he had found in a crumbling lighthouse and the steady gaze of a woman who smelled of earth and salt. For Maeve, it was the solitude she had always known, but it was different now, poisoned by a new and specific grief. That evening, alone in her tower, she watched the distant headlights of a car snake away from the village, and she allowed herself to believe it was him. She permitted herself one single shattering moment of pain, a silent sob that shook her entire body. Then she took a steadying breath, banked the fire in the hearth until it was a low, sullen glow, and went to check the light. She reinforced the solitary walls around her heart, brick by painful brick, preparing for the long, quiet vigil ahead. The beam swept out across the dark water, rhythmic and eternal, a duty that would remain long after the memory of a visitor had faded. The storm arrived not with a warning, but with a roar. It was a leviathan of wind and water, a once-in-a-generation tempest that threw the full, untamed fury of the Atlantic at the coast of Quan Royce. The sky turned a bruised, malevolent purple grey, and the sea, once a placid neighbour, became a raging beast, clawing at the cliffs with monstrous foam-flecked hands. Cillian was still in Galway, marinating in his misery, when he heard the news on the crackling radio of a pub. The peninsula was cut off. Power lines were down. He thought of the lighthouse, of Maeve's quiet words about the backup generator, its engine old and notoriously unreliable. A cold primal fear, sharper and more potent than any professional anxiety he'd ever known, seized him. He didn't think. He acted. Driven by a desperate, illogical need to be there, he threw cash on the bar and ran to his car. The drive back was a battle against the elements. The wind hammered the car, trying to tear it from the road. Rain lashed the windscreen in blinding sheets, the wipers fighting a losing war. Branches and debris littered the tarmac. But Cillian drove on, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his focus narrowed to a single point of light he prayed was still burning. When he finally reached the lighthouse, skidding to a halt in the mud-slicked yard, The generator was silent. The only sounds were the shriek of the wind and the deafening crash of the waves. The great light above was still turning, but its movement was erratic, faltering. He burst through the cottage door, unlocked as always, and took the spiral stairs of the tower 2 at a time, his heart pounding in his throat. He found her in the lantern room. She was soaked, her hair plastered to her face, her body straining against the massive manual crank of the light's clockwork mechanism. Her face was a mask of grim determination, her muscles taut with the effort of forcing the colossal lens to continue its life-saving rotation. In the distance, through the storm-lashed glass, he could just make out the faint lights of a fishing boat, caught dangerously close to the rocks, relying on this single faltering beam for its survival. She didn't have to ask. He lunged for the other side of the crank, his hands finding their place opposite hers. They fell into a rhythm born of pure necessity, their bodies moving in a desperate synchronized dance against the storm. They were a single entity, a four-armed, two-hearted machine, pushing and pulling, their breaths ragged, their muscles screaming in protest. The great light steadied, its beam once again a reliable, sweeping metronome of hope in the chaos. They worked in silence for what felt like an eternity, the storm their only soundtrack. Then, in a brief lull between the howling gusts, the tension that had been building for days finally snapped. The truth erupted from Cillian, a raw shout over the wind's dying moan. "I turned it down," he yelled, his voice hoarse. "The deal. I emailed Marcus hours ago. I told him no, or..." Maeve didn't stop cranking, her eyes fixed on the mechanism. "Why?" she gasped, the word torn from her. "Because there's nothing out there for me," he roared, the confession of physical agony. "Don't you see? I've seen it all, and it's all just noise, just empty rooms and clever sentences. This is the only thing that's been quiet enough for me to hear myself think, to feel anything at all." Her composure, the stoic armour she had worn her entire life, finally shattered. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the rain and sweat. "I thought you were gone," she cried, her voice breaking. "I was terrified, not of the storm. I was terrified of the morning, of waking up to a world that you weren't in." That raw, desperate admission was the final blow to their restraints. The world narrowed to the small, storm-battered room, to the space between their two bodies. The fishing boat was safe now, heading for deeper water. The light could wait. He rounded the mechanism and pulled her away from the crank. Her body, trembling with exhaustion and emotion, collapsed against his. He didn't guide her so much as they stumbled together, down from the lantern room into her small Spartan bedroom below. The air was cold, the only light the wild, intermittent flashes of lightning that illuminated the room like stark photographs. Her soaked clothes were a cold barrier between them, and they tore at the buttons and fabric with fumbling, desperate hands, a frantic need to erase every last separation. Their coming together was a collision, fierce and tender all at once. It was a brute claiming of territory and a gentle surrender, a desperate search for shelter in the storm of each other. His mouth found hers, and the kiss was not soft but ravenous, tasting of salt and rain and days of unspoken longing. It was the taste of homecoming. He laid her down on the simple cot, the rough wool of the blanket scratching against their bare skin. In the flickering elemental light he saw her, truly saw her, not as a keeper of the light, but as a woman, vulnerable and open and wanting him. There was a reverence in his touch, a sense of awe, as his hands explored the strong, lean lines of her body. This was not the practiced seduction of his former life. This was a prayer. He memorized the curve of her hip, the hollow of her throat, the surprising softness of her skin. She met his desperation with her own, her hands charting the unfamiliar landscape of his body, pulling him closer, deeper. There was no artifice, no gentle exploration. It was an act of profound, almost painful intimacy, a stripping away of every defence. It was a surrender not to lust, but to the undeniable gravity that had been pulling them together from the start. As the wind howled and the sea raged against the stone walls, they found their anchor in each other. He entered her with a sense of finality, a feeling of slots clicking into place, of a lifetime of wandering ending in this single perfect moment of belonging. Their bodies moved with the rhythm of the storm, a tempest of their own making, until they found their release together in a wave of shattering silent intensity. In the heart of the storm, clinging to each other in the quiet aftermath, they knew. He realised home wasn't a place on a map, but a truth you finally recognised in another's eyes. And she, who had spent her life believing strength meant keeping the world out, learned that its truest form was having the courage to finally let one person in. Dawn broke with the quiet clemency of a pardon. The storm, having spent its fury, had moved on, leaving behind a world washed clean, scoured and shimmering. The sea, so recently a violent aggressor, was now a sheet of hammered silver, placid and calm under a sky streaked with the pale, tender hues of a new day. The air itself felt different, lighter, scrubbed clean of its melancholic weight. In the small bedroom, tangled in the rough blankets, Cillian woke first. He watched Maeve sleep, her face soft and unguarded in the morning light, and felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost a physical ache. The restless energy that had propelled him across the globe for a decade was simply gone. In its place was a stillness, a certainty. He had found his true subject, not in the fleeting grandeur of landscapes, but in the quiet, enduring geography of a human heart. He stayed. There was no grand discussion, no negotiation of terms. It was an unspoken, settled thing. He moved his few belongings from the pub into the small keeper's cottage, his laptop and notebooks finding a home on a small desk overlooking the sea. He began to write again, but the words were different now. They were not for a magazine, not for Marcus, not for an audience hungry for clever descriptions. They were for himself. He wrote about the light, its unwavering sweep, a metaphor for constancy. He wrote about the sea, its moods and its mysteries. And he wrote about the woman who kept the light, her quiet strength a force more powerful than any storm. A few days later they stood together on the high balcony of the lighthouse, leaning against the cool iron railing. The sun was setting, a spectacular fiery affair that painted the clouds in shades of apricot and rose. The world felt vast and beautiful, but for the first time Cillian didn't feel the urge to capture it, to reduce it to a caption. He was content to simply exist within it, with her. He held a small new book in his hands. It was bound in dark green leather, sturdy and simple, much like her. He handed it to her without a word. It was a new logbook. She opened it, the scent of fresh paper and leather rising to meet her. On the first crisp, cream-coloured page, in his neat practice script, he had written only 2 words. Day 1. She looked up at him, her grey eyes, so often guarded and pragmatic, now filled with a quiet, brilliant light that rivaled the great lens behind them. A slow smile touched her lips, a genuine, unguarded expression of joy that made his heart clench. She reached out and placed her hand over his, where it rested on the open book. A silent pact, a shared story, just beginning. He lifted her hand from the book, turned it over, and brought it to his lips. He kissed her palm, then the calloused knuckles, a gesture of profound reverence for the life she had lived, for the work she did, for the strength in those capable hands that had held fast through the storm and had, in the end, held him too. It was not a kiss of passion, but one of promise, a promise of a life to be built not of grand, globe-spanning adventures, but of countless cherished days, measured out in the steady, sweeping rhythm of the light. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the great beam began its nightly turn, its light sweeping over them, blessing them, before stretching out to find its way across the calm and darkening water. It was no longer a lonely sentinel, but a beacon for a shared life, a testament to the soul that had finally blessedly come home. The Woman at Walheim. The Austrian hamlet of Walheim slept under a sky the colour of washed-out linen, a quiet corner of the world tucked away in the rolling green hills of the Salzkammergut. It was the early autumn of 1922, and though the Great War had been over for 4 years, its ghost still lingered in the crisp mountain air, a palpable presence in the silence that had settled over the valley. Here, the pastoral beauty of the landscape, with its gentle slopes and tidy farms, offered a stark, almost cruel contrast to the emotional scars that ran deep in the hearts of its people. The atmosphere was one of quiet melancholy, of a world slowly, painstakingly learning to heal, a sentiment that echoed the gentle yet profound emotional depth of a Gaskell novel. Victor had come to Walheim seeking anonymity, a place where the ghosts of the trenches might finally be laid to rest. He was a man hollowed out by the war, his youth and laughter buried somewhere in the mud and blood of the Italian front. Now, in his late 20s, his face was a mask of quiet observation, his eyes, the colour of a stormy sky, holding a profound sadness that he kept carefully guarded. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his body honed by years of hard labour, but his hands, though strong and capable, would sometimes tremble with the memory of things he could not, would not, voice. He sought solace in the grounding, repetitive work of the farm, the steady rhythm of the scythe, the warmth of the animals, the solid feel of the earth beneath his boots. Greta, on the other hand, was as rooted to the land as the ancient pear tree that stood in the centre of her family's farm. She was a woman of 25, though the weight of responsibility had etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth, making her appear older. With her parents gone, she managed the small farm with a quiet determination, caring for her 2 younger siblings, Lena and Jacob, with fierce protective love. She was the resilient heart of her small world, a woman of immense strength and quiet grace, but her heart was bound by a solemn promise, a vow made in the first flush of youth to her childhood fiancé, Franz, who was presumed to have died in the war. The memory of him was a constant bittersweet ache, a ghost she had learned to live with, a silent companion in her solitary life. Victor arrived at Greta's farm on a cool September morning, the mist still clinging to the valley floor. He had heard in the village that she was in need of a farmhand, and he had come offering his services. Greta, standing in the doorway of the farmhouse, her hands wrapped in her apron, studied him with a steady, appraising gaze. She saw the weariness in his eyes, the way he held himself as if braced for a blow, and in that moment she recognised a fellow survivor, a soul as scarred as her own. She hired him without asking for references, a decision guided by an instinct she could not explain. Victor proved to be a good worker, his silence a welcome respite from the well-meaning but often intrusive chatter of the villagers. He moved with a quiet competence, his hands sure and steady as he mended fences, chopped wood, and tended to the animals. He and Greta fell into a comfortable rhythm, their days measured by the cycles of the land, their communication often consisting of no more than a shared glance, a nod of understanding. But in the quiet evenings, after the children were asleep and the chores were done, a fragile bond began to form between them. Their first real connection, the first spark of something more than just shared labour, came on a quiet evening in the late October. A storm had blown in from the mountains, the wind howling through the valley, rattling the windows of the old farmhouse. One of the horses, a young mare named Liesel, had become spooked by the storm, her frantic whinnies echoing from the barn. Greta, her face pale with worry, had gone out to calm the animal, but Liesel, her eyes wide with fear, would not be soothed. Victor, seeing her struggle, had followed her out into the storm. He said nothing, simply moved past her into the stall, his presence calm and reassuring. He began to speak to the horse in a low, gentle voice, his words a soft murmur against the roar of the wind. He reached out a hand, not to touch the mare, but to simply let her know he was there. Slowly, Liesel's trembling subsided, her whinnies softening to a low nicker. Victor continued to speak to her, his voice a steady, comforting presence in the darkness, until finally the mare was calm. When he turned to leave the stall, he found Greta standing there watching him, her eyes shining in the lantern light. In that moment, she saw something more than just a quiet farmhand. She saw a man of profound gentleness, a man who understood the language of fear and suffering, a man who knew to soothe a troubled soul. He met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of something she had not seen before, a vulnerability, a longing that mirrored her own. An unspoken understanding of shared loss and weariness passed between them, a fragile, invisible thread that bound them together in the storm-tossed night. From that night on, the silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with a new, unspoken awareness. It was in the way his hand brushed against hers as they passed in the narrow hallway, the way his eyes would follow her as she moved about the kitchen, the way she would find herself listening for the sound of his footsteps, her heart giving a little flutter when she heard him approaching. The air between them was charged with a slow-burning tension, a quiet, insistent longing that was as undeniable as the changing of the seasons. They were two lonely souls, two people who had thought their lives were already written, their futures set in stone. But in the tranquil, isolated beauty of Walheim, amidst the lingering shadows of the past, a new and unexpected love was beginning to take root, a fragile blossom in the autumn of their lives. It was a love born of shared sorrow and quiet understanding, a love that held the promise of healing, of finding peace in a world that had been shattered by war. And as the days grew shorter and the nights grew longer, as the first snows of winter began to dust the mountain peaks, Victor and Greta found themselves on the cusp of a journey they had never expected to take, a journey into the uncharted territory of the heart. The passing of autumn into the quiet heart of winter brought with it a deepening intimacy between Victor and Greta. The raw, unsettled energy that had first defined their interactions mellowed into a steady, comforting rhythm, as reliable as the rising and setting of the pale winter sun. Their days were a shared narrative written in the language of the land, the sharp ring of the axe on wood, the soft lowing of cattle in the barn, the companionable silence of two people working side by side, their movements synchronized by a mutual understanding that transcended words. Victor's quiet competence became the scaffolding upon which Greta leaned, a steadying presence that eased the burden she had carried alone for so long. He began to speak, not in a torrent, but in fragments, like shards of a broken mirror reflecting a past he was slowly learning to piece back together. He never spoke of the horror, the deafening roar of artillery or the screams of the dying. Instead, he shared the strange, quiet moments of humanity he had witnessed between battles. He told her of a German soldier who had risked his life to save a stray dog trapped in no man's land, of the shared Christmas truce when enemies had sung carols to one another across the frozen mud, of the simple, profound beauty of a single poppy growing amidst the devastation. In these stories, Greta saw not the soldier, but the man, a man who had clung to his humanity in the face of unspeakable brutality. In turn, Greta found herself opening up to him in a way she never had with anyone else. She spoke of Franz, not as the ghost that stood between them, but as the boy she had known, the boy who had dreamed of building a new barn and planting an orchard of apple trees. She spoke of her deep-rooted love for the land, a love that was both her inheritance and her burden, of her hopes and fears for her younger siblings, of the quiet, lonely ache that had been her constant companion for so many years. In Victor's quiet, attentive presence, she felt seen, understood, as if the carefully constructed walls around her heart were beginning finally to crumble. One cold, wind-swept afternoon, while clearing out a small, disused shed, Victor came across a small wooden box. Inside, nestled amongst some old tools, was a half-finished wood carving of a bird, a kestrel with its wings half spread, its form still rough and unrefined. He knew without asking that it had been France's. He had seen the same patient, deliberate marks in the way France had repaired a broken gate, the same careful attention to detail in the sturdy construction of the old chicken coop. He took the carving back to his small room in the attic, and in the quiet hours of the evening, by the flickering light of a single candle, he began to work. His hands, which had once held a rifle, now held a small, sharp knife. He worked slowly, painstakingly, his touch both firm and gentle. He was not trying to erase Franz, to replace him, but rather to honour him, to finish what had been left undone. It was an act of reverence, a way of acknowledging the ghost that stood between them, of giving it a form, a tangible presence. He worked on the carving for weeks, each delicate shaving a prayer, each smooth curve a silent promise. He finished it on the eve of the winter solstice. The kestrel was now a thing of beauty, its wings poised for flight, its feathers so finely detailed they seemed almost real. He found Greta in the kitchen, her hands deep in a bowl of dough, her brow furrowed in concentration. He said nothing, simply placed the finished carving on the table in front of her. She looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. She reached out a flour-dusted hand and gently touched the bird's wing. The moment was thick with unspoken emotion, a silence so profound it seemed to hum in the air between them. In that small wooden bird she saw not just the memory of the boy she had lost, but the presence of the man who had found her. It was a mutual acknowledgement of the past that haunted them and the future that was beginning, tentatively, to bloom. A single tear traced a path through the flower on her cheek, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were filled with a gratitude so deep it left her breathless. The turning point came during the village's annual Winterfest. The day had been bright and cold, the air filled with the sounds of laughter and music, the scent of roasting chestnuts and mulled wine. For the first time in years, Greta felt a lightness in her heart, a sense of hope that was as intoxicating as the spiced wine she sipped. She watched Victor as he effortlessly lifted young Jakob onto his shoulders so he could see the puppet show, a rare, genuine smile gracing his lips. In that moment her heart gave a lurch, a sudden, fierce recognition of a feeling she had long thought buried. They returned to the farm as evening fell, the laughter of the village fading behind them. The warmth of the day had vanished, and the wind was beginning to bite. Inside the farmhouse, a cheerful fire was crackling, and Lena and Jakob were chattering excitedly about the festival. As Greta helped them out of their coats, she glanced out the window. The sky overhead had deepened to a bruised purple, and the first flakes of snow were beginning to drift down. "A storm is coming," she said, her voice quiet. "Victor, would you help me check on the animals? I want to make sure the barn is secure." He nodded, and they pulled their coats back on, leaving the warm, noisy kitchen for the biting cold outside. The wind was stronger now, howling down from the mountains and whipping the snow into a frenzy. They hurried across the yard to the barn, the heavy wooden door groaning in protest as they pushed it open and slipped inside. They were plunged into a sudden, muffled silence. The only sounds were the roar of the wind outside and the soft, contented rustling of the animals in their stalls. A single lantern cast a warm, golden circle of light in the vast, shadowed space. The air was thick with the familiar, comforting scent of hay and animals and cold stone. They stood for a moment, breathless and dusted with snow, the world outside entirely shut away, leaving only this intimate, protected space. "That came on fast," Greta said, her voice softer than she intended. Victor nodded, his eyes fixed on her. The lantern light caught the snowflakes melting in her hair, turning them into tiny glistening jewels. He reached out, his movements slow, deliberate, and brushed a flake from her temple. His fingers, rough from work but surprisingly gentle, lingered for a fraction of a second against her skin. It was a touch that changed everything. The air between them, already charged, became electric. The silence was no longer empty but filled with the deafening beat of their own hearts. He did not move his hand away, but let it cup her jaw, his thumb stroking softly along her cheekbone. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed, a soft sigh escaping her lips. He lowered his head, his gaze intense, searching hers for a sign, a signal. She gave it to him, rising slightly on her toes, her body swaying towards his. Their lips were a breath apart, the promise of a kiss, of a release from the tension that had been building for months, hanging in the air. But at the last possible moment he hesitated. A shadow of conflict, of profound sorrow passed through his eyes. It was the ghost of France, the weight of his own honour, the deep respect he had for her loyalty to a memory. To kiss her now would be to steal something, and he was not a thief. He let his hand drop, taking a small, almost imperceptible step back. The spell was broken, but the unspoken thing between them was now undeniable. A living presence in the room. The ghost of that almost kiss was more powerful, more intimate than any touch. They stood in the charged silence, the storm raging outside, a pale imitation of the tempest within. The walk from the barn to the farmhouse was the longest of their lives, each step heavy with what had almost been, and what might now, impossibly, still be. The fragile peace of Walheim and of Greta's heart was shattered by the arrival of a letter. It came on a Tuesday morning, a day like any other, the sky a crisp, unforgiving blue. The postman, a cheerful, ruddy-faced man named Klaus, handed it to Greta with a smile, oblivious to the fact that he was delivering a ghost. The envelope was thin and worn, the handwriting unfamiliar, the postmark from a city in France she had never heard of. Her hands trembled as she opened it, a cold, sickening dread coiling in her stomach. The letter was not from France, but from a doctor at a military hospital. The words were simple, direct, devoid of emotion. France was alive. He had been a patient there for years, a man without a name, without a past, his mind and body shattered by the war. A recent breakthrough, a flicker of memory, a name whispered in a fevered dream, Greta, had led them to her. He was coming home, the world tilted on its axis. The solid, comforting reality of her life, the farm, the children, Victor, dissolved into a dizzying, chaotic blur. France. Alive. The words were impossible, a cruel joke, a nightmare from which she could not wake. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, the letter clutched in her hand, the world around her silent and still. She felt nothing, a strange, hollow emptiness where her heart should have been. Victor found her there minutes later, her face as white as the snow outside. He saw the letter in her hand, the look of stunned disbelief in her eyes, and he knew, with a terrible gut-wrenching certainty, that something had broken. She handed him the letter without a word, her eyes pleading with him to tell her it wasn't true, that it was all a terrible mistake. He read the words, his own heart turning to ice. He looked at her, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes held a universe of pain. Franz returned a week later. The man who stepped off the train at the small Walheim station was a stranger. He was thinner, his face gaunt, his eyes holding the haunted, vacant look of a man who has seen too much. He walked with a limp, his body a testament to the brutality of the war, that it was him, it was France. He looked at Greta, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a ghost of the smile she remembered, and he whispered her name. In that moment, Greta's world, the world she had built with Victor, the world of quiet understanding and unspoken love, crumbled to dust. This was the man to whom she had promised herself, the man she had sworn to love, to honour, to wait for. How could she turn him away? How could she deny him the life that had been stolen from him? Victor, a man of quiet, unshakable honour, understood. He saw the impossible choice she faced, the unbearable weight of her duty. He saw his own presence on the farm in her life as an intrusion, a complication she did not need. That evening, as the shadows lengthened and the cold deepened, he told her he was leaving. "He is your future, Greta," he said, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the turmoil in his heart. "I was just a visitor," Greta, overwhelmed by the shock of France's return, by the crushing weight of her own sense of duty, could not find the words to ask him to stay. She wanted to scream, to rail against the unfairness of it all, to tell him that he was not a visitor, that he was her home, but the words caught in her throat, strangled by a lifetime of promises, by the sad, lost look in France's eyes. Her silence was a blow to Victor, a confirmation of his deepest fears. He misinterpreted it as relief, as her final unspoken choice. He saw in her silence not the agony of a torn heart, but the quiet acceptance of a woman returning to her rightful place. The days that followed were a living hell. The farmhouse, once a sanctuary of quiet comfort, was now a prison of unspoken words and simmering tensions. The air was thick with the ghosts of what might have been, with the palpable presence of a love that was now forbidden. France, though physically present, was emotionally absent, a hollow shell of the man he had once been. He would sit for hours by the fire, his eyes vacant, his mind lost in the labyrinth of his own broken memories. For Victor, the fresh pain of this new loss was a trigger, a spark that ignited the smouldering embers of his own trauma. The nightmares returned, the trembling in his hands grew worse. The ghosts of the trenches once again his constant companions. He felt doomed to be a wanderer, a ghost himself, forever on the outside, never truly finding a place to belong. He had found a fragile peace in Walheim, in Greta, and now it was being ripped away from him, leaving him more broken, more lost than before. Greta watched him, her heart breaking with every tremor of his hand, every shadow that crossed his face. She was trapped, imprisoned by her own honour, torn between her duty to the broken man who had returned and her desperate, all-consuming love for the quiet man who was healing her. The pastoral beauty of Walheim, once a source of solace, now seemed to mock their pain, its quiet no longer peaceful but heavy with unspoken words and shattered hopes. She was watching the only true peace she had ever known, the only true love she had ever felt, pack his meagre belongings and prepare to walk away from her, and she was powerless to stop him. The silence in the house was a deafening roar, a testament to all the things they could not say, to the love that was being sacrificed on the altar of duty. The morning of Victor's departure dawned cold and grey, the sky a leaden blanket that seemed to press down on the valley, suffocating all hope. He had packed his few belongings in a small worn canvas bag. He moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, each action a final, painful severance of the ties that bound him to this place, to her. Greta watched him from the kitchen window, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She had not slept, her mind a torment of unspoken words, of what-ifs and if-onlys. Franz was sitting by the fire, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, his eyes, for the first time since his return, clear and focused. He had not been blind. In the shared glances, the charged silences, the palpable tension that filled the house whenever Victor and Greta were in the same room, he had seen the truth. He had seen the profound, unspoken love that existed between them. A love that was a living, breathing thing, a stark contrast to the faded, ghostly memory of what he and Greta had once shared. He turned to her, his voice quiet but firm. "You love him." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Greta flinched, her eyes filling with tears. She could not deny it. She could not lie to this man who had already lost so much. "He is a good man," Franz continued, his gaze steady, his voice devoid of bitterness. "I have seen the way he looks at you. It is the way a man should look at the woman he loves. It is the way I used to look at you before. He gestured vaguely, a small helpless movement of his hand that encompassed the war, the hospital, the years of lost memories. He rose from his chair and came to stand before her, his hand still clutching the warm mug. "My war is over, Greta. I have come home, but I am not the same man who left. I don't think that man exists anymore. I want to find peace, not a prison. And you deserve to be happy. You deserve a love that is real, that is present, not a promise made to a ghost." He reached out and gently took her hand. "Go to him," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. Regret, resignation, a quiet, profound dignity. "You are released from your promise. Go." The words were a key, unlocking the cage of duty and honour in which she had been trapped. Freed from her obligation, she did not hesitate. She ran from the house, her feet flying over the frozen ground, her heart pounding in her chest. She found Victor at the edge of the village, his bag slung over his shoulder, his back to her, about to walk out of her life forever. "Victor!" she cried, her voice raw with desperation. He stopped, his shoulders tensing, but he did not turn around. She ran to him, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and stood before him, her face revealing everything she had been unable to say, her love, her pain, her desperate, all-consuming need for him. He turned then, and seeing her, really seeing her, the truth of her love reflected in her tear-streaked face, he understood. The dam of his carefully controlled emotion, the wall he had built around his heart to protect himself from further pain, finally be... "Greta," he whispered, his voice cracking. I thought I had to leave. I thought it was what you wanted." "No," she choked out, the single word a torrent of emotion. "No, I want you. Only you." He pulled her into his arms, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was not one of gentle longing, but of desperate, pent-up passion. It was a raw, explosive release of all the pain, the fear, the unspoken desire of the past months. It was the taste of salt and snow, of sorrow and salvation. It was a confirmation that their souls had long been intertwined, that they were two halves of a whole, two broken pieces that could only find wholeness in each other. He lifted her into his arms and carried her back towards the farm, his long strides eating up the ground, his purpose clear, his destination certain. He took her not to the house, but to the barn, to the hayloft where their love had almost been born. He laid her down in the soft, sweet-smelling hay, the scent of it a memory, a promise. The lantern cast a halo of gold around them, a sacred circle in the gloom, muffling the sound of the storm outside. What followed was a desperate healing fusion of two souls, an act that transcended lust to become a form of worship. His hands, no longer trembling, mapped the curves of her body through the coarse wool of her dress, his touch both a question and a claim. He found the buttons of her bodice, his fingers fumbling with an urgency that made her breath catch. The first touch of his warm palm against the cool skin of her collarbone was a shock, a brand. She arched into him, a soft, involuntary sound escaping her lips. He undressed her not slowly, but with a raw, reverent haste, his eyes never leaving hers. His gaze a testament to a love so profound it was almost painful. Her own hands were just as eager, pulling at his rough shirt, needing to feel the solid warmth of him. Her fingers traced the hard planes of his chest, the taut muscles of his stomach, and then, with a tenderness that made his eyes close, the raised, silvered scars on his back. Each one was a story she wanted to know, to heal with her touch, with her lips. Their coming together was a slow, deliberate act of surrender, a vulnerable, deeply emotional communion. It was the heat of skin against skin in the cold air, the whisper of breath, the scratch of hay, the silent, desperate prayer of two people who had been lost and had finally found their way home. He entered her with a reverence that shattered her, a joining that was less a taking and more a homecoming. She followed his lead without thought, her body finding his rhythm, their connection unfolding like a dance of pure, unadorned need. It was a release, a letting go of all the pain, the fear, the loneliness. In that hayloft, amidst the scent of hay and the quiet stillness of the winter morning, they found not just pleasure, but redemption. They found a sanctuary, a place where their brokenness could be made whole, where their scars could be seen not as marks of damage, but as proof of their survival. Victor realized in that moment that love was not another battlefield to be lost, but a sanctuary to be cherished, a place of safety and healing. And Greta understood that true honour lay not in keeping a promise made to a ghost, but in embracing the living, breathing love that had saved her, that had brought her back to life. They were no longer two separate, lonely souls, but one, their hearts beating in unison, their futures finally, irrevocably intertwined. Victor stayed. The decision was not a grand pronouncement, but a quiet, unspoken certainty that settled over the farm like the morning mist. His bag, once packed for departure, was unpacked, and its meagre contents returned to the small attic room that was now, finally, his home. France, with a quiet grace that spoke of a wisdom forged in the crucible of immense suffering, gave them his blessing. Walheim, he said, held too many ghosts for him, too many memories of a life that no longer felt like his own. He decided to move to Salzburg, to a larger town where he could build a new life for himself, a life unburdened by the past. He left not as a tragic figure, but as a man who had found a different kind of peace, a man who had chosen to let go of what was lost in order to make room for what might yet be found. With France's departure, a new, gentle quiet settled over the farm. The oppressive weight of unspoken words and unresolved tensions lifted, replaced by an easy, companionable silence. The daily work of the farm, once a solitary burden for Greta and a means of escape for Victor, became a shared joy. They moved in a comfortable, familiar rhythm, their hands often brushing as they worked, their shared glances speaking volumes. The farm began to thrive under their combined care, the field seeming greener, the animals more content, the old farmhouse itself seeming to breathe a sigh of relief. The love between them was not a fiery, passionate blaze, but a steady, warm glow that illuminated every corner of their lives. It was in the way he would bring her a cup of coffee at dawn, his hand lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. It was in the way she would mend his worn work shirts, her stitches small and neat, each one a tiny declaration of her love. It was in the easy laughter they shared over the dinner table, in the comfortable silence they fell into as they sat by the fire in the evenings, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her. Months passed. Winter gave way to a tentative spring, the snow melting to reveal the rich, dark earth, the first green shoots pushing their way towards the sun. The world was waking up, being reborn, and with it so were they. The shadows in Victor's eyes began to recede, replaced by a quiet contentment, a sense of peace he had never thought possible. The premature lines of worry on Greta's face softened, her smile now a frequent, radiant thing that lit up her whole being. One cool spring evening, as the setting sun cast a golden glow over the valley, Victor sat on the front porch, a small block of wood and his carving knife in his hands. He worked with a quiet concentration. His hands, once a source of shame and a reminder of his trauma, now a source of creation, of beauty. He was no longer finishing someone else's work, but creating something entirely new, something born of his own heart. He presented it to her later that evening, as they sat together in the quiet twilight. It was a small, intricately detailed carving of a woman tending to a garden, her face turned towards the sun, a look of serene joy on her features. It was Greta. He had captured her strength, her resilience, her deep, abiding love for the land, all in that small piece of wood. She took the carving from him, her fingers tracing the delicate lines. She looked from the carving to him, her eyes full of a love so deep, so profound, it needed no words. He reached out and took her hand, no longer trembling, but strong and steady, and held it to his heart. They stood there for a long time, two silent figures silhouetted against the deepening twilight, looking out over the fields of Walheim. The air was filled with the sweet scent of damp earth and new blossoms, the sound of the evening birdsong a gentle symphony. The peace they had found was not the absence of scars, but the healing of them together. Their pasts had not been erased, but integrated into the fabric of their present, the threads of their individual sorrows woven together to create a tapestry of shared love, of mutual understanding, of profound, enduring joy. The melancholy had lifted from the valley, replaced by a quiet, hopeful hum, and on the small farm in the heart of Walheim, a love that had been born in the shadow of loss had finally gloriously come into full bloom, a testament to the resilience of the human heart, to the transformative power of a love that was both a sanctuary and a home. Ashes and wild roses. The wind in Montana had a voice. It was not the hurried, indifferent whisper of city air, but a deep, lonely sigh that swept down from the mountains and across the plains, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of a distant, clean rain. It was a sound that hollowed out the world, leaving a vast, intimidating space that mirrored the emptiness inside Donna. She stepped out of the hired car, her tailored blazer and sharp city trousers a jarring note against the wild, untamed landscape of the sprawling wildlife sanctuary. The fabric, meant for boardrooms and investor meetings, felt thin and useless against the sheer scale of the sky. At 32, Donna felt ancient. The empire she had built, an intricate architecture of code and algorithms, had vanished in a single catastrophic keystroke, market crash, a betrayal, a public humiliation. It had taken everything, including her engagement to Julian, her co-founder, and the man who had shared her ambition like a second skin. Now she was a refugee, fleeing the double wreckage of a life she no longer recognized. He was waiting for her on the porch of the main ranch house, a figure so perfectly a part of the landscape that he seemed carved from the same weathered wood as the building itself. Tristan was 38, but the lines around his eyes held the patience of a much older man, the kind of patience born from watching seasons turn and mountains stand unmoving. He didn't smile, but his greeting was polite, his gaze steady and reserved. He had seen volunteers like her before, idealists with haunted eyes, running from something sharp-edged and urban, who rarely lasted until the first snow. He showed her to a small, clean cabin, the air inside smelling of cedar and wood smoke. Her luggage, a set of sleek, hard-shelled cases, looked absurdly out of place on the rustic pine floor. She wanted to unpack, to create a semblance of order, but her hands felt useless, clumsy. I built an empire of code and it vanished in a keystroke, she thought, the words a bitter, silent refrain. What am I supposed to do with something so real, so broken? Her primary responsibility was a horse. Tristan led her to a far corral away from the other animals. The creature inside was a maelstrom of barely contained energy, a wounded Mustang recently rescued and vibrating with a profound, wild mistrust. A jagged scar, pale and puckered against its dark coat, marred its flank like a brand. He was trapped in a barbed wire fence, Tristan said, his voice low and even. Took us 3 days to get him here. He's not ready for company. He simply called him the Mustang. Donna, looking at the fire that burned in the animal's dark, intelligent eyes, a fire that mirrored the ruin in her own soul, privately named him Ash. Her first attempts to connect with the horse were a disaster. She approached the fence with the same nervous, goal-oriented energy that had served her so well in securing venture capital. She held out a hand, her voice a low, placating murmur. Ash responded by rearing back, his nostrils flaring, his powerful body a tense sculpture of fear and defiance. He shied away from the frantic hum of her thoughts, the scent of her failure. Tristan watched from a distance, leaning against a fence post, his silence a more potent form of judgment than any words could have been. She felt it acutely, a familiar heat rising in her cheeks. After her third failed attempt, he walked over, his stride unhurried. "He knows you're in a hurry," he said, not unkindly. "Horses always know. You can't lie to them." Donna's hands clenched at her sides. In her world, speed was a virtue, a necessity. Patience was a luxury for those who could afford to wait. She had never been one of them. That evening, a brief, sharp shower swept across the plains, and the air filled with the clean, almost holy scent of wet sagebrush. Donna stood at the window of her cabin, watching the last light bleed from the sky. The metallic clang of the stable gate swinging shut in the wind echoed the sound of a door closing on her old life, a sound she had been hearing in her sleep for weeks. The vast, empty space of Montana didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a cage, bigger and more terrifying than the one she had left behind. Weeks bled into one another, marked not by deadlines and product launches, but by the slow, immutable rhythms of the sanctuary. The rising sun, the pre-dawn feedings, the long, quiet hours of labour. Donna shed her city skin, layer by layer. The sharp angles of her posture softened. Her hands, once accustomed to the smooth, cool surface of a keyboard, became calloused and capable. The vastness of the landscape, once so intimidating, began to feel less like a void and more like a space to finally breathe. She changed her approach with Ash. Instead of trying to do something to achieve a result, she simply began to be. She would bring a folding chair and a worn paperback into his enclosure, sit just inside the fence and read aloud. Her voice, at first hesitant, grew stronger as she lost herself in the familiar cadence of the printed word. She read Austen and Bronte, the measured, elegant prose a stark contrast to the wildness around them. For days the horse ignored her, standing at the far end of the corral, his scarred flank turned pointedly towards her. But gradually he began to watch her. His ears would swivel in her direction, his head lifting from its grazing. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long golden shadows across the plains, he took a single, deliberate step toward her, then another. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on her, his breathing a soft, rhythmic huff in the quiet air. Donna didn't move, didn't breathe. She just kept reading, her voice a low, steady murmur, a fragile thread of connection woven in the vast silence. Tristan found her there late one evening, long after her official duties were done. The sky was a deep velvet indigo, studded with an impossible number of stars, a universe away from the light-polluted skies of the city. She was just sitting with the horse, the book lying closed in her lap. Ash stood nearby, utterly calm, occasionally dropping his head to nudge her shoulder. Tristan didn't speak at first. He simply handed her a thick ceramic mug, the warmth seeping through into her cold hands. The coffee was strong and black, and it tasted of the fire it had been brewed over. This time he didn't retreat to a polite distance. He leaned against the fence beside her, his presence as solid and comforting as the ancient pines that dotted the landscape. It was their first real conversation. She spoke vaguely of her past, of a project that didn't work out, the words feeling flimsy and inadequate to describe the scale of her failure. He listened without judgment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Then he told her about the Mustang. "We found him after a wildfire swept through the basin last year. he said, his voice a low rumble. That scar on his flank, it's a burn. He was the only one of his herd that made it out. The fire took everything else. He paused, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. The land always comes back, though. After a fire, things grow back stronger. Different, but stronger. The quiet, rhythmic sound of Ash chewing hay in the nearby barn was the only sound for a long moment. Donna looked down at the coffee mug in her hands. Its simple, earthy warmth, a profound comfort. "In my world," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "if something breaks, you discard it and get a new one. You don't with it." "Out here," Tristan replied, his gaze returning to the vast star-dusted sky. "Nothing's ever really new. It's just a different version of what's always been. Scars are just part of the story." She looked up at the Milky Way, a brilliant, shimmering river of light that seemed to pour across the heavens. For the first time in months, the crushing weight in her chest seemed to lift, just a little. She felt a tentative, fragile peace begin to settle in her soul, a peace as quiet and vast as the Montana night. The peace was a fragile thing, easily shattered. It was fractured by the sound of a luxury rental car crunching its way up the gravel drive, the low, aggressive hum of its engine, an alien sound in the sanctuary's quiet. And then the sharp, insistent ring of a cell phone, a sound Donna hadn't heard in weeks. A sound that made the muscles in her shoulders instantly tense. Julian stood on the porch of her cabin, looking handsome, charismatic, and utterly, profoundly out of place. His Italian loafers were polished to a high sheen, and the dust of the sanctuary seemed to actively refuse to stick to them. His cologne, a cold, sterile scent she had once associated with success, now smelled only of confinement. He said he had come to get her back. He said he missed her. But his language was the language of their old life, a dialect of mergers and acquisitions, of salvaging their professional reputation, of second-round funding and market shares. He spoke of her time at the sanctuary as a charming, rustic sabbatical, a quaint little detour before her inevitable return to the real world. He framed her failures as problems he, and only he, could solve. "Come back, Donna," he urged, his hand resting on her arm with an easy, familiar possessiveness. "We can fix this. Don't throw away your entire life for a bunch of stray animals and a man who probably doesn't even own a decent suit." Tristan saw them together from across the yard. He saw Julian's hand on her arm, saw the familiar, tense set of her shoulders, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. He gave a single brief nod in their direction and then turned away, his retreat so complete, so absolute, that it was as if a door had been quietly but firmly closed between them. He was once again the polite, distant caretaker, his eyes holding nothing but the vast, impersonal patience of the landscape. Donna felt herself torn in two. Julian spoke her old language, a language of ambition and validation, a language she had once craved more than anything. Why did it sound so foreign now? Why did it feel like a cage? Tristan represented a peace she was only just beginning to believe she deserved, a quiet, steady strength that felt more real, more valuable than any stock option or public offering. The conflict was a storm inside her, and Ash, with his preternatural sensitivity, felt every turbulent gust. He became agitated, difficult, shying away from her touch, his eyes rolling with a familiar wild fear. He was a mirror, reflecting the turmoil of her own fractured soul. Julian stayed for 2 days, his presence a constant low-grade irritant. His phone buzzed incessantly, a nervous, anxious sound that grated on the sanctuary's deep, abiding silence. He talked of their future, a future that sounded exactly like their past, a future that felt like a beautifully appointed, elegantly furnished prison. On the second evening, as Julian was once again outlining a strategy for their professional comeback, Donna found herself looking past him, out the window of her cabin, towards the distant, darkening mountains. She felt a profound, aching longing for the quiet companionship of the man who smelled of sagebrush and wood smoke, for the simple, uncomplicated trust of the wounded horse who was just beginning to heal. She was standing on a precipice, the life she had built on one side, a new, unknown, and terrifyingly beautiful world on the other, and she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that she could not go back. The storm broke that night, a sudden, violent squall that descended upon the plains with the force of a physical blow. The sky turned a bruised, angry purple grey, shot through with jagged veins of lightning. The wind howled, a primal, cathartic scream that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the world. The storm terrified Ash. He was a creature of the wild, a creature of fire and instinct, and the violent, elemental fury of the thunderstorm sent him into a blind panic. With a sound that was half scream, half whinny, he crashed through the fence of his corral and bolted, a dark, frantic shape disappearing into the rain-lashed darkness, heading for the treacherous, rocky hillsides. "Let him go," Julian shouted, grabbing Donna's arm as she made a move to run after the horse. "Be reasonable, Donna, it's just an animal." His words, so calm, so logical, so utterly dismissive of the wild, beautiful, broken thing that had become the centre of her world, were the final, irrevocable straw. She shook off his hand, her eyes blazing with a cold, clear fury that made him take a step back. She found Tristan by the stables, already saddling his own horse, his movements economical and sure in the flickering light of a lantern. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He simply nodded towards a second horse, already saddled and waiting. Without a word, a silent, unbreakable understanding passing between them in the heart of the storm, she swung herself into the saddle. They rode out together into the tempest, a silent, determined team, the driving rain plastering their hair to their faces, the wind tearing at their clothes. They found Ash in a narrow ravine, his leg caught in a tangle of fallen branches, his eyes wide with terror. The sound of their approach sent him into a fresh panic, but Tristan's voice, low and steady, a calm, reassuring rumble beneath the roar of the storm, seemed to reach the terrified animal. Working together in the driving rain, their movements synchronized by a shared, unspoken purpose, they managed to calm the horse, to gentle him, to free him from the tangle of branches. The journey back to the barn was a slow, arduous one. Ash was limping, and they had to lead the horses, their boots sinking into the mud, the wind and rain a constant punishing assault. When they finally reached the shelter of the main barn, they were soaked, shivering and emotionally raw. The storm still raged outside, the rain drumming a frantic, relentless rhythm on the roof, but inside, in the warm, hay-scented darkness, there was a strange, profound silence. They stood facing each other, the lantern light casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. And in that moment, with the storm raging around them and the shared, profound relief of the rescue settling in their souls, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. He reached out and brushed a stray wet strand of hair from her face, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. The touch lingered, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. The kiss that followed was slow and searching at first, a question asked in the dark, but the recognition in that touch, of shared wildness, of a resilience forged in fire, ignited something primal. The kiss deepened, becoming a raw, hungry claiming. It was the taste of rain and earth, and a longing so profound it stole the breath from her lungs. His hands were rough and sure, tangling in her wet hair, pulling her flush against him. She could feel the hard strength of his body, the frantic beat of his heart against her own. Her gasp became a moan as his mouth left hers to trace a fiery path down her throat. Their fumbling with the wet, heavy clothes was an act of desperate urgency. Buttons gave way, denim was pushed aside, and then there was only the shocking electric heat of skin meeting skin in the cool, hay-scented air. He laid her back in a pile of soft hay, the rough strands scratching faintly at her back as his hands and mouth began a slow, deliberate exploration. He worshipped her body with a reverence that made her tremble, his calloused fingertips tracing the curve of her hip, his tongue tasting the salt on her skin. He discovered every secret place, every sensitive hollow, until she was arching against him, a wordless plea on her lips. He brought their bodies together, and it was a homecoming, a collision of two worlds that had been orbiting each other from the moment they met. The rhythm of the storm outside became their own, a tempest of shared need and shattering relief. It was a silent language of touch and breath, a surrender so complete and absolute that it felt like being broken open and remade, not by force but by a profound and overwhelming tenderness. The storm outside raged on, a wild, untamed symphony of wind and rain, but in the heart of the barn, in the warm, hay-scented darkness, they created their own storm, a wild, beautiful and terrifyingly real moment that burned away the last vestiges of the woman she had been, leaving in its place something new, something stronger, something that had been forged in the heart of the fire. Several weeks later, the world was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of impossible, aching clarity and air that tasted of clean earth and new beginnings. Julian was a ghost, a memory. A final, sterile email from him, confirming the legal dissolution of their company, had arrived a week ago. Donna had deleted it without a single pang of regret, the words dissolving into the digital ether, as ephemeral and meaningless as the life they represented. She walked out to the pasture, the late autumn sun warm on her face. Ash, though still favouring his leg, trotted to meet her, his gait no longer frantic but steady, sure. He nudged her shoulder with his head, a gesture of quiet trust and affection that filled her with a deep, uncomplicated joy. Tristan was waiting for her by the fence line, leaning against it in the sun, his silhouette a familiar, comforting shape against the vast expanse of the plains. He didn't speak, but his eyes, the colour of a clear autumn sky, asked the question that hung in the still, clean air between them. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice steady, her gaze meeting his without a flicker of doubt. "I've cashed out my remaining assets. I want to invest them in the sanctuary. This is my new venture. This is my home." A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the weathered skin at their corners. He pushed himself off the fence and pulled her into his arms, his embrace strong and sure. The kiss was no longer just comforting. It was full of promise and a deep, smiling passion. He kissed her like he was memorizing the taste of her, a taste of sun and wind and second chances. His touch was both strong and tender, a silent language that speaks of building a future, of planting roots in this wild, beautiful place. It was a promise whispered against her skin, under the vast, accepting sky. As she stood there, wrapped in his arms, her head resting against his chest, she saw them for the first time, a cluster of wild roses, late blooming and impossibly resilient, growing along the fence line, their delicate, defiant beauty a splash of colour against the weathered wood. She had come here thinking she needed to rebuild a life from the ashes, only to discover that the most beautiful things don't have to be built at all. They simply need the space to grow,